basically right on the water. I also want to acknowledge my fellow ENDC volunteers. If you could raise your hands. If any of you are not registered to vote, these folks can help you get registered to vote. And if you like what you hear tonight and you're not a member of ENDC and you want to become a member, they can also help you with that. Also, speaking of voting, I think we have at least one candidate in the room today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Sonia. I'm running for supervisor in District 6. And I'm here because this is a really important issue and I have to make sure I know a lot about it. So yeah, come to the District 6 debate, which is I think on July 24th. July 24th, guys. Mark your calendars. We're really excited. Thanks.
We don't have any others, do we? All right. And yeah, speaking of those debates, we have two. One is the District 6 on the 24th, and we also have District 10 on July 17th. So if you live in District 6 or 10, come on out. Okay, now I'll introduce the panelists really quick. So this is Mark Stacy. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, and he focuses on the physics of sea level rise in tidal estuaries, and in particular the interactions with human infrastructure and resilience of communities along the shoreline. Next we have Lynn Navarro, Resilience Program Director at the Port of San Francisco, and she's responsible for all the port's resilience activities. She recently developed and ran the Adapting to Rising Tides program, which is a nationally recognized climate adaptation program. And she will talk about the seawall program at the port, among other things. Next, we have Kelly Pretzer, Development Director at Forest City Realty Trust, and she is responsible for the entitlement and development of Pier 70, which is a 28-acre mixed-use development on the San Francisco Central waterfront and the Dogpatch area. And finally, Amelia Luna, Project Manager at Sherwood Design Engineers. Amelia is a professional engineer. I'm an engineer too, so yay, although not a professional engineer. And she is bonus points to you. And she's a member of the Sliss Creek Resilience by Design project team. Her specialty is water reuse projects, including wastewater treatment and net zero water systems. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to the panelists. We're going to have each one do a little short presentation and then a little discussion and Q&A, so all of you can get your questions answered. So Mark?
Hi, thank you. Really nice to be able to join you here tonight. I've been speaking about the work we've been doing at Berkeley in a variety of fora over the last couple of years. I think this is a great chance to get down into the local issues. Our work tends to look regional. And so I'm going to try to bridge that. Most of my slides and the content will focus on kind of regional bay issues, but through that hopefully give a lens into why we should have some regional perspective when thinking about local challenges. We're going to hear several local examples of particular vulnerabilities or projects in the next few talks. So I'm going to kind of be stepping out from that a little bit, but we'll try to keep in mind this bridge from local to regional. So coastal flooding, sea level rise. We have this long, slow trend towards higher water levels. On top of that...
Oh wait, can I stop you for 1 second? Because I work for the government, I'm going to say... No, FYI, we have Isabella putting us on Facebook Live, okay. And so I just want to note to everybody who's here that that is happening.
Okay.
Gotta be legal. Disclaimer.
So, with this long, slow drift to higher water levels, but on top of that is all of the other things that cause water to go up and down. In San Francisco Bay, the tides are a key part of that story. I'm going to come back to that several times here in the next few minutes, talking about how this long trend towards higher water levels really only matter when you think about how the tides are going up and down on top of it. And it's the nature of the tides that define a particular flooding event. Now, NOAA some years ago referred to these kind of tidal flooding events where the water rises and floods some things and then drains back off again as a nuisance flood. It comes and goes in a relatively short time scale. Maybe it's not particularly damaging. It's not very high velocity flows that are going to damage things. It just kind of gets things wet and then goes back down. Examples here, that's a big storm on the left, that's Superstorm Sandy. But Tam Junction, just north of San Francisco here on Highway 101. Miami, they refer to it as sunny day flooding. So this is a new phenomenon as sea levels have risen, that the tides start to have this effect. Where they get things wet and then they drain back off again. But when you start thinking about how often that happens, you have to ask yourself, when does it stop being a nuisance and become something more than that? And these bars on the right are just sort of an illustration of how many times per year there's a nuisance flooding event for various cities on the eastern seaboard. The top couple, Washington, D.C., that light blue bar is 365 events per year. So that means the daily high tides are flooding certain parts of Washington, D.C. It might be a walkway through a park, or it might be an underpass in a roadway, but these nuisance events are not happening every single day. And at some point you change your behavior, it's much more than just a nuisance. So this is kind of the direction we're going. These things are more frequent, they last a little longer. Gradually over time you start to experience it a little bit further. The other sort of multiplier to think about here is how other systems layer into that disruption. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. These are some numbers related to wastewater infrastructure. The lower number is how many people would be flooded in southeast U.S. just straight their residences flooded, 2 million with 3 feet of sea level rise, for example. The upper number, 8.4 million, is how many people would have their wastewater infrastructure disrupted by that same level of sea level rise. So you have to look beyond just who's getting their ankles wet and think about what other systems are vulnerable. And it's even more true in a highly urbanized system like San Francisco Bay. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here and talk about San Francisco Bay shorelines and the risk of flooding.
We're going to have signs with Austin, I think.
No, okay. All right, just keep my eye on the signs. So, San Francisco Bay has undergone a lot of transformations in the last 150 years. The little sketch on the left shows what the bay shorelines looked like before development. And the green areas are tidally active marsh habitats. So what you see is much of the bay shoreline were these natural marshes which would get wet at high tide and drain off at low tide. The right is the shoreline as of around 2000, before the more recent restoration activities have taken hold, but it doesn't look that different today from what it looked like around 2000. There's a few more tidal marshes, but not a lot. So that's the big difference. Right? Pre-development, you have all this tidal habitat around the perimeter where the tides go in, they fill the marshes, they drain back up. Now what we've done is we've placed levees and made use of those marshes. We've reclaimed them. That was the reclamation era. It's now transforming to restoration, but the reclamation meant we build levees and then we construct something. It might be salt ponds, it might be industrial parks, it could be residential, but we develop in some way the lands that were historically tidal marshes. So that's a big change in the bay shorelines. And what it means is that we're thinking more about this little sketch in the lower right, which is about containing our waters, where we prescribe where our shorelines are going to be, and we put structures there to define them. Levees, seawalls, even constructed marshes have some elements to this if they're not allowed to naturally progress and evolve. The alternative is the sketch above that, which would be an accommodation strategy, which says that as waters rise, we just allow them to go where they go. So these are the two extreme alternatives that we can think about when preparing for sea level rise. Keep the shorelines where they are today and put structures in place, or allow the waters to spread out and inundate other lands. So what my team has been doing is building a set of models to understand these interactions, where we take projections of sea level rise, combined with scenarios for our shorelines, and then we look at what the implications are for the region. So we look at where things flood, how frequently, to what extent, what infrastructure systems are disrupted by that, and what it means for the region. And I'll show you a couple examples of that, just to kind of illustrate that regional perspective. So the first looks at transportation infrastructure. So the scenario that we've created here is to say, suppose that we have 1 meter of sea level rise. actually now considered a fairly moderate projection for the end of the century. At the time we started this project, it was considered a kind of outer envelope. So the projections are changing. But 1 meter of sea level rise. And then for the shorelines, we said, well, let's suppose that every community, every segment of shoreline, all the way around the bay, pursued some kind of protection strategy where they build infrastructure to prevent flooding, except for the city of Berkeley. We picked on ourselves. Okay? And so that's the little red circle there, which shows where there's a vulnerability that's left in place by the city of Berkeley, that as sea levels rise, the waters start to flood and inundate existing infrastructure. Well, you know what the waterfront along Berkeley College looks like. It's I-80, right? And so if that vulnerability disrupts transportation infrastructure in a fairly severe way. So it's a strategically chosen example. The highway heat map here is sort of the intuitive one that we're used to reading. Green, yellow, orange, red, meaning different levels of congestion. In this case, a red segment means that the travel time on that segment is double relative to what it experiences when there's not this vulnerability in Berkeley. Okay? So what this illustrates, which any commuter in the Bay Area, anybody who tries to get out of the Bay Area on a Friday afternoon would understand, is that a vulnerability at one location cascades through the whole region. So now communities like Sausalito, Walnut Creek, Concord, experience a cost or a disruption based on what Berkeley does or doesn't do with its waterfront. It also means these inland communities should be interested in investing in what those bayfront communities are doing, either in time, resources, etc., getting involved with those decisions. This is a way that there's some leverage or some momentum created towards the regional conversation, local vulnerability that impacts the region. Along San Francisco, where we see this occurring most to the greatest extent, is along the segment of 101 by Candlestick Park, just south of San Francisco, technically. That's another very vulnerable segment. There, the regional impact is not as regional. It tends to shunt onto 280, and it disrupts the San Mateo and Bay Bridge flows. Okay? So again, you have a local vulnerability that then creates congestion that extends regionally. Another example of these kinds of infrastructure interactions is the wastewater infrastructure. Most of the Bay Area's wastewater treatment facilities sit on the Bay Shore. We have 37 of them. That was great from a wastewater perspective. Gravity takes the water down to the facility. Once the water is treated, it's released directly into the bay. The tides flush the bay. Great system. But as sea levels rise, you lose that function. You lose potentially the gravity feed to the treatment facility. You lose the ability to release the water into the bay without pumps and other things to overcome the rising sea levels. All this sketch is meant to do is illustrate the variability in when different facilities experience the threat. The more filled the pie is, the greater the threat to the facility. Red means it's immediate. Blue means it's a little bit further off in the future. And so you can see the variability, and you can imagine the challenge that creates to thinking regionally. Because one facility has something that they have to think about tomorrow, and another facility doesn't have to worry about it for 50 years. And the lifetime of these facilities is shorter. So it creates both an interest in the investment, in the planning, but it also kind of creates a barrier to the conversation. All right. The last part of the story that I like to tell involves the tidal dynamics. I think what I'll try to do here is just paint a very brief picture of this to illustrate why people around the region should care about what's happening in different segments of the shoreline. These three traces show the tides at three different locations in the bay. The middle panel shows the tides. This is for May, just this year. At the mouth of San Francisco Bay, the tidal range is about 7 to 8 feet from high to low tide. As you go north in the bay, that's reduced. The tides are reduced as you move up the bay. But as you go south, the bottom trace is for Alviso, the southern end of the bay. There, the tides are amplified by 60%, and they're actually 11 feet from high tide to low tide. The reason they're amplified is because of the shape of the bay and the nature of the shorelines. And so as we move into the future and sea levels rise and we make decisions about where to place our shorelines, we're going to affect these tides. Might make them smaller, could make them even more amplified. If you find ways by allowing more accommodation to reduce that tide, you can buy some protection. So there's a regional opportunity to get some protection. The last thing I'll finish with, so all of these regional stories, and I'm happy to talk more about the tidal story in particular if we in the questions. Why is it important to think regionally? Why not just say, okay, my community, my wastewater facility is going to be looking at 20 centimeters of sea level rise in the next 20 years. So I'm going to just build some protection. I'm going to put a wall there or a levee. I'm going to just take some local action. It's a very rational approach. It looks at the immediate threat and kind of the minimal approach to addressing it. And it's a strategy that will be pursued if you just focus on those elements. But what happens over time, so these are the levees in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. What happens over time is that the water levels continue to rise. And then you have to add a little bit more. And you add a little bit more, a little bit more. This cross-section is New Orleans. And you see the city of New Orleans sitting below mean water level. They didn't plan it. They didn't plan 150 years ago to build a city below water level. Over time, the city subsided, combined with a little bit of sea level, mostly about subsidence. They gradually progressed towards having a city that's below sea level. We would be on the same path if we took these incremental steps. But of course, eventually, then you need pumping systems to keep the streets dry and to get the stormwater up, and you run the risk of a catastrophic event, like what happened in New Orleans with Katrina. So that local short-term approach of saying, build a little levee, build a little wall, add to it, add to it, add to it, puts you on a path that can be very vulnerable. Now, I don't want to undermine local approaches.
You're not.
But I think that a counterbalance to thinking about this local is to think longer term and to think regionally about where we want to be. And I'll leave it there.
It's a very provocative place to be.
So how do we get to
So, thank you. I am going to awkwardly have the laptop on my lap. Try and present at the same time. It's down here. Right there?
Yeah.
Is that the right one?
Yeah. Thank you.
It's really thinking. I think it did it. There we go. Okay, great. So I am Lindy Lowe, and I'm with the Port of San Francisco. I joined the port back in September, and I am going to be talking about the port's approach, past approach to sea level rise, and how we're moving into a new frame of thinking based on the fact that we're going to be addressing or confronting higher water levels going forward. So I wanted to start out with a whole San Francisco sea level rise map. I think, the eastern neighborhoods are well represented in the sea level rise zone. But don't worry, we'll come up with strategies. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, not to bore folks, but there is a sort of city and regional and statewide frame within which we do this work. The Ocean Protection Council just updated their sea level rise guidance for all of the state agencies as well as the local agencies. And so the numbers are not changing dramatically. Some of them are even going down in some instances, in some time frames. But there is one thing that they're asking local jurisdictions and state agencies to do, and that's to look at an extreme number, which is 10 feet, and it's called the H++ scenario. And that's when you're really planning areas that just will not get wet. And then within San Francisco, we have capital planning. So if one of the city departments is taking action in a sea level rise zone, they have to fill out a form that indicates what it is they're doing, what is the time frame for that, what's the
recommendations on that project. And then the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which is the place that I worked before I came to the Port of San Francisco, has sea level rise policies that require that projects be resilient to 2050 and adaptable to 2100. And so that provides a sort of guardrail or guideline for us when, and you'll hear about the Pier 70 project and how they're addressing that, and some of the other projects that have been developed along the Port of San Francisco. So we have also been working very closely with the other city departments. The city planning department has what they're leading something called the Sea Level Rise Coordinating Committee, and they're conducting a vulnerability and consequences assessment for all parts of the city except for the 3 miles of the seawall. MTA came out with a climate adaptation and climate action strategy that has adaptation strategies within it. And the SFPUC has been doing a lot of work. So we're working within the city departments to really understand what actions should we be taking together and coordinating and knowing what each other is doing. The port also has some building blocks. We have strategic planning goals that are specific to sea level rise. Our waterfront land use plan update added a resilience section and a number of resilience recommendations. The way the port's been approaching sea level rise and flood risk, current and future flood risk to date, is on a project-by-project approach. So as a project comes in, the Port Commission asks the staff to say, how will this project address current and future flooding? And then we identify strategies to do that. And then the seawall program's starting to take that a step further, where we're looking at an entire reach of waterfront. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So here are a couple of examples of the project-by-project approach. Mission Rock, which is, I think just went to the Bay Conservation and Development Commission last week and got approved, is raising the elevation up by 4.5 feet, and they're also developing a lot of other strategies to address sea level rise and flooding. The Crane Cove Park project is designed for 28 feet of sea level rise and occasional flooding on the park thereafter.
28.
28 inches. Oh, that would be great. No, that would be over. Sorry. And then Brennan Street Wharf is adaptable to about 16 inches of sea level rise. And so one of the challenges with the project-by-project approach is, as you can see, there are a variety of ways in which developers and project proponents are responding to sea level rise. They're responding at different water levels. They're not able to take into account some of the landscape scale problems. So this is a great example. The Water Emergency Transportation Authority is developing new docks for new ferries down behind the agriculture building. And they're also building a plaza that is designed to endure, I like that word, sea level rise to 2065 and then adaptive to 2100. But what that means is if you stand on the Embarcadero roadway right now, you are looking way up at a plaza that if all we want to do is save a plaza, we can all stand on it while the floodwaters, inundate everything around us. And that's also true for the new ferry terminal. So or the new ferry dock. So if you stand on the other side of the agriculture building, where you walk up Pier 14, you will see how low the Embarcadero is compared to that new construction. And so that really calls into question, well, a project-by-project approach can get you so far, but it certainly can't solve the problem. So now I'm going to talk really briefly about the Seawall program itself. The Seawall Earthquake Safety and Disaster Prevention Program is the long name for it, but we call it the Seawall Program because that's too long a name. And this gets back to one of the things Mark said earlier on, that there is a historic shoreline and there is the shoreline that we currently have. And the historic shoreline is that yellow dotted line. If you walk from the waterfront right now back to the Transamerica building, that once was all mud flats. But the state of California decided that they wanted to have a deep water port in San Francisco, and they also wanted to stop all of the vessels from getting stuck in the mud flats and then being abandoned. So they built a new seawall. And so where the seawall currently sits had mud flats and bay on either side of it, and now it just has land and bay. The seawall is over 100 years old and has not been reconstructed since it was developed. This is the study area. So the study area includes a 500-year flood event plus 66 inches of sea level rise. So that is what's depicted there, and that I think gives you a good sort of picture of the seawall segment flood risk, which is significant at the higher water levels. The focus, the first phase or element of the seawall program, the thing that we're focusing on first is the earthquake safety. It's the seismic safety. We have a significant seismic safety risk in this area, and this depicts what could happen if we were to have an earthquake right now along the waterfront. So we could have a loss of the transportation infrastructure, the utilities, as well as a number of the buildings, and have significant damage, loss of life, as well as impacts to emergency response. A lot of San Francisco's emergency response actually happens through the port. And so if we were to have a significant seismic event and lose the port, we would lose our ability in the city to actually respond to an emergency. And I think that this sort of makes local what Mark was saying about why you need to look beyond just, well, the port can deal with this and I don't care. This will have significant implications on the entire city of San Francisco as well as beyond San Francisco. And the beyond San Francisco gets into the transportation infrastructure. If you look at the lower picture, that depicts a 100-year flood event potentially right now on a king tide, which is we could flood the BART and Uni Tunnel if we were to have a significant storm event at the long end. And so that's a current flood risk, albeit very, very rare, but it will get more frequent as waters rise, and that's obviously something that we can't let happen. This demonstrates the different flooding thresholds along this part of the waterfront, and I think it's important to recognize the need to phase the work that you're doing when it comes to sea level rise. We're focused on seismic and near-term flood risk in the first phase, but we're also looking at what is it that we need to do for the future phases, the future water levels. And so with 6 inches of sea level rise, which isn't very much, we start to have flooding in our lowest spots around the river. And then with 12 inches, we have more areas that overtop. And then with over 24 inches, you have more widespread flooding that absolutely, we're not just plugging low spots. We need a landscape scale solution again, where we're really looking at how do we protect this whole area and reach. We're conducting a refined flood assessment, which I can talk about a little bit later if people have questions. But we are actually getting a better understanding of the bathymetry and really diving deep, literally, to understand what's going to happen as water levels rise in this particular part of the waterfront. We're also going to have modeling that shows 6-inch increments of flood risk, which is very refined and will be very helpful for us in our planning. Here are some of I think it's helpful for folks to see that in sort of the near to mid-term protection strategies for sea level rise, many of them are not dramatic. You're talking about maybe putting a barrier at different locations. The railings that you see around the port facilities right now could actually be made watertight. You could make the historic buildings water resistant or waterproof. We could identify those things like under the pier utilities and move those up and out, those things that just can't get wet. But there are a number of small moves that you can make in the near to midterm to protect against sea level rise and current and future flooding. And then once you get, again, those higher water levels, then you need to move to landscape scale solutions. So we're trying to figure out how do we move through a process where we're addressing multiple hazards, seismic, which is ground shaking and liquefaction, and flood risk. And they have different time frames and they have different responses. And so we have on this website, and you don't have to spend a lot of time looking at this, but this is just to give you a sense of where we're at in our development of an adaptive planning model, which is right now, element 1 is strengthen the seawall for public safety, and our focus really is on life safety and emergency response. Phase 2 or element 2 is adapting to near century risks and really focused on those higher water levels and more areas of seismic. What do we do to do that work? As well as the context within which we're doing that work. So do we, at that point in time, work with the PUC to address a particular issue along the waterfront? Or do we work with MTA on bike lanes along the Embarcadero at the same time? And the important thing too on the adapt element is that it goes from the 3 miles of seawall to the port's entire 7.5 miles. So then we pull in the entire port property when we move to adapt. And it will be, the adapt plan will be updated every 5 years so that we can take into consideration the changes in science and projections, as well as any additional funding, or be opportunistic about grants, or opportunistic about other projects that are going on in the city. And then, and increase the priorities that we're looking at. And then element 3 is envision. And that's really, how do we respond on a landscape scale? How do we re-envision the waterfront along the port's properties to these higher water levels? What are those landscape scale solutions? What areas do we maybe pull back from? What areas do we absolutely defend? And what are the ways in which we could defend? Because I'm very sensitive to Mark's point that we don't want to just keep adding elevation for the sake of protecting things that may not make sense in future context. We want to really make incremental decisions, both because we don't want to wind up below water and have catastrophic events, but also because there are a number of priorities in the city and you want to make sure that you're not overspending, overdesigning, and overdeveloping. So just to touch on, we have a community and technical process that we're going through, and we would love anybody to join us. We have a policy and technical advisory committee that we're developing to help guide us through this. We just had our first Seawall community quarterly meeting. We have focus briefings. This is not exactly one of them, but if you want one, we can definitely give you one that's more specific to the seawall. And then, thank you. Test the one.
It's working so far. Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Pretzer. I work at Forest City.
Thank you.
I work at Forest City on the Pier 70 project. I joined Forest City in 2013, so coming up on 5 years working on this project.
There's nothing too bad in there.
Okay.
It's a nice one. Me too. You want me to grab it? I'll grab it.
Yeah, I don't know where it is.
No worries.
Forest City is a real estate investment trust. We're headquartered in Cleveland. We have projects in New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, Dallas, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. We build primarily apartment buildings and office buildings, and we build to hold, which is kind of unique. A lot of, there's a different model where you might build a condo building with the objective of selling the condos, and then, but we build buildings and we own and operate them over the long term. So I wanted to give you a quick history on Pier 70. There has been a lot of planning work over the past decade, and this is just the past decade. There's been work done certainly before this. The Pier 70 is owned by the Port of San Francisco. The port undertook a community planning process from 2007 to 2010, which culminated in the endorsement of the Pier 70 master plan. And what that master plan did was it divided Pier 70, which is 69 acres in size, into 4 essentially sub-areas. And we'll go into what those sub-areas are. From there, the port identified 28 of those acres, so a little bit, approximately a third of the site, as a mixed-use development opportunity, and they issued a competitive solicitation. And Forest City was ultimately selected as the developer in 2011. From there, we undertook extensive planning, both under CEQA, but also through negotiation of transaction documents with the port. There was also a little ballot measure that was thrown in 2014. Just last year in 2017, the project was finally approved by the Board of Supervisors. And so just a mere, 7 years later, we are ready to start construction. Over the course of that planning process, we have held a number of events. You may have attended some of them. I don't know if maybe you went mini golfing over, it was a couple summers ago. We hosted the Bayview Community Market, San Francisco Street Food Festival. Those were both a way to bring people down to Pier 70 to see how wonderful a site it is, and some really incredible buildings that are down there. But also a way for us to surreptitiously get community feedback. Sometimes people aren't really excited to show up at a workshop or a focus group in the evening, but they really are excited to come to the Street Food Festival, for example. So I had my little booth down there, and everyone would come up and wonder what delicious food I had to offer, and they were very disappointed when they found out that I wanted to talk to them about the Pier 70 project. But it was a really great way to engage with people who maybe otherwise wouldn't engage and to get that community feedback on what it is that people want to see at Pier 70 in the future. So this is Pier 70 from bird's eye view, and this is to the point I made earlier about the Pier 70 master plan dividing it into certain sub-areas. You have Crane Cove Park at the north. You have the ship repair facility, which is currently looking for a new ship repair operator. You have the 20th Street Historic Core buildings, which are being rehabilitated by a different developer, Orton Development is their name. They actually did the Ford Assembly plant in Richmond, which is fantastic if you ever find yourself over there. And then you have the Forest City site, which is approximately 28 acres in size and pertinent to our discussion, and inhibits about a third of the shoreline at Pier 70. So this is kind of zooming out. You're now on the looking west, and you can see the shoreline here, and then Illinois and 3rd Street behind. So the project is mixed use with a combination of office and residential uses, retail on the ground floor, and rehabilitation of 3 historic buildings, buildings 2, 12, and 21, and then 9 acres of parks and open space along the waterfront, and then also pulled up into the interior of the site. The program in general is between approximately 1,000 to 2,000 residential units, and between approximately 1 million to 2 million square feet of commercial office. The reason for that range, just to move back, is that the southern end of the site is adjacent to the former Potrero power plant, and as we were going through the planning process, it's a little unclear what would happen with that site, and that's why it's zoned kind of like you see all over SOMA, where something could be either office or housing, depending on sort of what makes sense at the time, since a project like this will be built out over 10 to 15 years. So the Pier 70 project includes a host of public benefits. 30% of the housing units will be affordable. We have a 17% local business enterprise utilization goal, rehabilitation of historic buildings, generation of approximately $50 million in transportation impact fees. But the one that I'm here to talk to you about today are waterfront site resiliency and adaptive management strategies. So the park system, as you see here, is essentially a network of open spaces, and we're going to focus on the ones along the waterfront. Moving north to south, you've got Waterfront Terrace, Slipways Commons, and Waterfront Promenade. And the thing about the Pier 70 shoreline is that it varies. Up here in the north, you have a much more sort of a riprap type condition. Here, what's identified as Reach 2, you have a bulkhead condition. Here along Reach 3, testament to the site's historic use, those are historic slipway and craneway piers. So there's actually pretty significant concrete infrastructure running up the middle of the site, because that was essentially, think of a ramp, right, that leads down into the water, and that's where the boats were repaired and then kind of pushed back out into the bay. So you have these really interesting little finger piers, or historic craneway piers, that are still extending out into the water and will be retained as part of the design. So when we start at the northern end of the site, I have a section diagram here. So what the project proposes to do is to elevate the entire site to protect the buildings to the 66-inch sea level rise estimate, and to protect the Bay Trail to the 24-inch future sea level rise estimate, which at the time of this planning, so it's a 2100 level for the buildings, and a 2050 level for the Bay Trail. And so the means of doing that is a little different depending on what the shoreline condition is. I have to admit I'm a little self-conscious talking about this with this panel because I am certainly the least qualified to talk about the technicalities of it. So forgive me for using probably the wrong terminology and not getting into the details. But essentially what we've done is sort of tilted the site on its side. So if we go back actually to our bird's eye view here, you have a high point of the site up here where it says FG, and then the site slopes down. So where you're actually raising the site approximately 10 feet at this high point, and then you're sloping all the way down to 20th Street, which is an existing street, so we're meeting existing grade there. And the reason you do that is because you want to protect these buildings along the shoreline to that 2100 level. You have gravity-fed utilities, so everything behind that needs to get higher and higher. So it's a pretty significant excavation and earthwork operation in order to do that. Another kind of interesting factoid while we're talking about it is this building here, Building 12, is an existing historic building. It would be buried if you were to raise everything around it 10 feet. And we looked at that and it kind of had this bathtub feel that wasn't working. So because that's a steel structure, you learn something new every day. That is, if you were going to raise a building up 10 feet, that is the building that you would want to do it to. So we are literally removing it from its foundation, lifting it up 10 feet, and then building a roadway around it so that it would appear to have that same spatial relationship to the ground and have the same volume. So it's fortunate that designing that sort of worked out that way. So this is a view of the water's edge today. You can see the ship repair facility in Building 6 there. This is a view of it in the future where you've extended the Bay Trail. This is one of the more green areas of the site. Being a formerly industrial site, there's a lot of hardscape in the open space planning and the design. This is down in the southern end of the site, so you see those crane wave piers that I mentioned before, the Bay Trail continuing on and extending down south. And again here you have riprap, short paths, seating terraces, and then building its way back up to the Bay Trail. These seating terraces in particular are something that we're really excited about because they're a really great architectural and landscape feature. It's something that people will be able to use to get close to the water, but also as sea levels rise, it's something that is not it's not a big tall barrier. It's something that ultimately, as the level of the bay goes up and up, the shoreline itself will retreat, and those will be submerged more and more frequently. And then finally, at the southern end of the site, you have again a more riprap condition, so continuing to build up that slope there until you've reached the elevation high enough to protect the Bay Trail, high enough and set back enough to protect the Bay Trail. And so this is just a couple of fun renderings as we are working through our parks design. One of the features that we're really excited about are these sort of viewing pavilions here out on the shoreline that frame particularly impressive views and serve as sort of an architectural and public art feature. And this one has really large swings, which I think will be a really cool way to hang out at the shoreline. And so I think the thing that I would conclude with is, I kind of walked you through a very quick summary of the project design and how we're thinking about sea level rise in our design. And that's one of the strategies that we're using, but the other strategy is much more boring and has to do with money and financing. So the project has an additional assessment over and above its property tax that is dedicated to funding future shoreline improvements that are needed both at Pier 70 as well as elsewhere throughout the city. And so the idea is that we will build to the estimates and the best knowledge that we have today. And in the event that we're wrong in the future, we have a built-in funding source to pay for future improvements as those are needed, or to contribute to improvements in other areas that don't have a large-scale infrastructure development that's coming online. And so that was something that was an important priority of the ports, and something that certainly we see. It doesn't make sense to have a Pier 70 that's above water and everything else around it is submerged. Right? We need to protect the entire shoreline, and so that's another way that the project can contribute to those improvements. So with that, I'll hand it over to Melinda. Okay, I'm gonna try and help too. Okay.
It's just the craft.
It's just
among other uses. Historically, if we kind of look, we saw some historic shoreline maps on some of the other projects and some of the slides Mark presented. Islas Creek was a giant marsh, and that shoreline was really receded back, and we've done a lot of that fill in there over the years. So you can see some of the historic levees in that marsh area being built up, some of the reclamation district as they were called, and then finally the channelization of the creek after the 1906 earthquake. A lot of the rubble from the downtown areas were used to fill the Islas Creek watershed or basin. So now looking west, back there you can see Islas Creek Channel, and some of the port operations at the bottom of the screen, and all the way up to Vernal Heights, and Twin Peaks is really the crest of that watershed. So again, large watershed. So I'm jumping now into what we did when we studied this area. In January, our team was 10 teams in the RBD competition were assigned. Islas Creek, it was a site that the city had identified as being high risk and wanting that team to investigate. So we were selected and we looked at some of the risks. So I'll go through this panel here talks about some of what we call urban risks. I'll go through some of the climate risks, which is the topic today, as well as some of the other kind of development risks, I guess. Well, not the right word, but some of the other risks that we see. And on a positive note, with opportunities and a vision that we've created. So displacement is happening right in this area. We want to understand more about that complex phenomenon. Vehicular conflicts, there's a lot of truck traffic. I mentioned all the logistics, and so we see some conflicts there. Pollution, historically, this is an industrial area. There used to be lots of tanneries, the Navy area, and also lack of accessibility. So these are what we call the urban challenges. So I know these slides are small. They actually come from a report that's available online, and so I can give folks the link to that at the end of the presentation. But what we're showing here is just the level of analysis that we did to try to understand some of these urban challenges. So what were the PDR sectors? So production, distribution, and repair. Again, critical functions for the city. What were the kind of jobs that we saw there? Again, most of the a lot of blue collar jobs in this area, and in total about 22,000 jobs within the Islas Creek Basin. So it's an important job center for the city. Mobility, where do folks work that live there? Where do folks live that work there? And how do they get around? We saw some of the photos, some of the conflicts that we see. Some of the demographics, so proportionally more minority communities living in this area than other parts of the city. Apologies for the slow build up here. But again, some analysis looking at the historic pollution, looking at soils, groundwater, and also displacement. So we were starting from a place of just trying to understand what the dynamics are in this community, some of the historic issues that are very real. Incidents of vehicular conflicts, lack of accessibility. So then looking at more towards infrastructure. So what were some of the public assets at risk? What were some of the current land uses? What was the land value? So trying to evaluate what was at risk is dollar signs speak when we talk about risk due to climate change. And what were some of the businesses in the area? So for the land value at risk, and I apologize, this slide builds up very slowly. The graphics are great, but they take a while to load. So looking at there we go, great. What we found in doing some layering on some of the uses and values is that about $700 million of privately owned land was at risk, and this is in both districts 9 and 10 in San Francisco. Land uses at risk, again, PDR Industries, that big purple bar. These are uses that are critical again to the city function. I'm just going to keep skipping through a lot of slides. So, and the public assets. So what's really interesting about this area is that a large portion of the lands are publicly owned by the city, owned by the port, MTA, Caltrans, other entities, and there are a lot of assets at risk. The area in blue that you see, this watershed houses the largest major infrastructure at risk, and now we're getting to sort of the meat of the climate change risks. So flooding, the rising of groundwater with sea level rise, and sea level rise itself, and then seismic hazards. So Lydia touched on liquefaction, which is, I think that occurred during the Little Creator earthquake in the marina. We have unstable soils, and they experience liquefaction during earthquakes. So we were able to dig up some photos of some of the historic terrestrial flooding, so flooding that occurred in the inland areas as well as the coastal flooding. And then, apologize for the resolution here, but we looked at were a few scenarios. So you've heard people mention the 2050 scenario, the 2100 scenario, tidal amplification, storm surge is another sort of layer to add on to these scenarios that we want to look at. And the selection of your sea level rise scenario is pretty important. And so we wanted to understand, we looked at, this was mainly a long-term study, so we wanted to look at the farther out scenarios. There are a couple of scenarios you can look at for 2050. Worst case scenarios, we're looking at storm surge and other king tides and these sort of less frequent events, whereas like more likely scenarios, we're not necessarily compounding those events. And in 2100, you can get to up to 15.5 feet of sea level rise. I'm not sure if that quite aligns with the H++ scenario that Lydia mentioned, but there are these scenarios were specific to Islas Creek versus the South Bay, where we might see more tidal amplification. There's less of that here in the northern part of the peninsula. So I'll just flip through these. I've got some larger images, but as you can see, the flooding is both from the bay as well as from inland, water coming down the watershed. And then groundwater is an interesting issue that often gets overlooked. It had come up in the Rebuild by Design competition in New York, and seepage of groundwater rising with sea level rise has actually become a big issue on the Lower Manhattan site where our team members are working. Seismic hazard, you can see that line, and a lot of these lines are pretty much following an historic marshland. So that area is all fill and it's subject to liquefaction. And there's a high probability of a significant earthquake occurring in the future. So we compounded all these together and we call it a risk sandwich. So there is of course the risk of a perfect storm, but there's also risks of some combination of these events occurring. And that's what we were trying to understand, is how do we create an adaptable vision for this area that can respond and be resilient to this risk sandwich. One way, and this kind of before, is full retreat. We just say we're not going to live in this bayland anymore. Well, I mentioned all those really important activities that happen there that are critical to the economy of the city. A full retreat scenario, I think you would jeopardize some of the economy that drives the city. So maybe that's not going to work. Then there's the full protection scenario, and that's come up a couple times in other presentations where we just say, oh, we're going to armor this whole area. It's all very important. We're protecting it all. Well, what you end up with is a scenario where you're relying on a lot of pumping, a lot of mechanical systems to manage natural phenomena. And as those phenomena become more extreme, as sea level rises, as maybe the modeling's not quite clear, but we probably will see some more extreme rainfall events. That becomes a higher burden on that infrastructure to pump water out. This is sort of the New Orleans scenario. So maybe that's not the way we want to go fully either. And this is just actually on the bottom right, I've X'd it out. It's a pump station. I can't remember the name of this particular pump station, but it is one in New Orleans. So this is kind of the magnitude of infrastructure that would be needed to get all of the water up and over that fully protected watershed. And you can see the treatment, the wastewater, Southeast wastewater treatment plant shown in red. So this is an example of the level of terrestrial flooding coming from down the hill that we would need to get out, and the size of the pump station that would be needed to do that. So what do? We kind of come up with this hybrid approach, right? What are the areas that are very important to protect? In order to have a deep water port, we need a seawall protected area so that ships can get in and out practically. Okay, we want to retain that function. Let's protect the deep water port. And so those are some of the areas we looked at. But where are the areas that we might be
we supply water